Dear friends, we now come to the chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. At the end of chapter 10, we saw that John had to eat a little book, and we understood that it was a prophecy related to chapter 12 of the book of Daniel that concerned the last days. Now we'll see John still playing an active part in this prophecy. And he is being asked a few things. Let's read the first part of this chapter 11. Revelation chapter 11 verses 1 to 14. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod. The angel stood saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees, and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut heaven, so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the streets of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days, and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. Now, after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered into them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. In the same hour there was a great earthquake, and the 10th of the city fell. In the earthquake 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Now John is asked to measure. But to measure what? To measure 3 things: the temple, the altar, and those who worship there. Well, we have in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet, in chapter 43, the same scene. Ezekiel is present when the temple is measured. What does it mean to measure the temple? I propose we turn to the chapter 43, verse 10. Ezekiel 43 will be reading verse 10 to 12. Son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern. And if they are ashamed of all that they have done, make known to them the design of the temple and its arrangement, its exits and its entrances, its entire design and all its ordinances, all its forms, and all its laws. Write it down in their sight, so that they may keep its whole design and all its ordinances and perform them. This is the law of the temple. The whole area surrounding the mountain top is most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple. You may have noticed that there are 2 sequences in this prophecy. First, Ezekiel is asked to measure the temple and to show the plan to his fellow citizens. For what purpose? Probably to show God's holiness on one side and human misery on the other, and how God wants to both keep his distance and at the same time to come closer to man. The holy place in the sanctuary where God is supposed to dwell, which is very close to the place where man addresses prayers, that is to say, on the altar of incense. Thus, this reveals real closeness and yet a long way apart. This distance is marked by a veil. It is a veil that separates the most holy place from the holy place in the sanctuary. And the epistle to the Hebrews teaches us that this veil is none other than Jesus, because it is He alone who can establish the link between the holiness of God and man's defilement. So, the first step is to show the plan of the sanctuary to his fellow citizens, and this plan must make them feel ashamed. Then, if faced to this plan they blush with shame, that is, if they realize their meanness and weakness compared to the holiness of God, then comes a second step. Ezekiel is invited to show them the working of temple, the entries and exits. To some extent, he is intended to show them what work Jesus performs in the sanctuary. Because the work of Jesus in the sanctuary has no other purpose than to bring man to purity and thus enabling him, in the end, encounter with God, get in touch with him. So you see, measuring the sanctuary has a very specific meaning. If we move forward in the text, we may realize that the text will still reveal other elements. Because John has to measure the temple, the altar, and those who worship there. To measure those who worship means he is required to exercise some kind of judgment. In fact, it is to know whether those who worship are all there. You know, when you get on a plane, before takeoff, people are numbered. Do you remember what was said to those souls who were under the altar? To rest a little while longer. A white robe was given them, their ticket to heaven, that is the white robe, their guarantee. But they were told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brethren who would be killed as they were be completed. So here, so to speak, we are watching this counting. And the fate of those people who, until the last moment, may die, is not the most detestable one. I invite you to look at chapter 14 of Revelation, verse 13, what is said here about them. Revelation 14, verse 13, let's read together. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Write, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them." It is said, blessed. So, in these difficult times, there are those who die and are finally called blessed, because they are at rest during those troubled times. This is not an easy task. They rest from their works, but what they have achieved, their good deeds, follow them. And then there are those who are alive. So for those who are alive, the lane is narrow. Let's read in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 27. Also, the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. In that great day of atonement, there is no alternative but to humble one's soul, to acknowledge what was not right, what went wrong for us, so that God may remedy. That is the part of the living. Then in our text of Revelation 11, it is added that John must leave out the court and not measure it as it has been given to the nations. It is a little surprising because in the sanctuary in the wilderness, in the tent of the meeting, there was no court outside, there was just a court. Whereas in the temple described by Ezekiel, there were two courts, an outer court and an inner court. And here we are told regarding to the outer court not to measure it and to leave it to the nations. It means that the nations at that moment are not measured. That is, they are not judged for one simple reason. The judgment that takes place at that moment is the judgment of the house of God. It is Apostle Peter who teaches this. Let's read it in the first epistle of Peter, chapter 4, verse 17. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? In other words, this judgment, in fact, is intended to set apart the people of God, those who have walked with God, from the final judgment that will follow. We can compare it to justice courts that existed in the past in France. Courts of indictments. Then, the role was assigned to the investigative judge. But the role of the indictment division was to say, in this case, there are not enough ground for charges to accuse such and such, so they are to be removed from the judgment. On the contrary, the others will have to go on trial. Therefore, it is either a judgment of exclusion or a judgment of salvation, whereas the final judgment that will follow is the judgment of the wicked. So, let's see what comes next. We are told that the holy city will be trampled. Do not measure the outer court because it has been given to the nations, and they will tread the holy city. You can ask, what holy city? It is Jerusalem. In Arabic, Al-Quds, the Holy One. Thus, it is the holy city, Jerusalem. But what does she represent? Please read with me in chapter 21. Chapter 21, verses 1 and 2. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there is no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. A bride adorned for her husband. Obviously, if one speaks of the holy city, the New Jerusalem, we think of a place. But when we look at this text, it does not refer just to a place. It's a people. It is the Lamb's spouse. It is the church. It is the whole body of the believers. So this holy city trampled on by the nations is nothing else than God's people trampled underfoot by the nations. And when we are told in the book of Daniel that the power of the holy people will be reduced, annihilated, that the holy people will be completely shattered, it is the same as when we are told that the holy city will be trampled. The interesting thing is that we are given the duration time. Let's look at the text in Revelation 11, verse 2. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. In other words, 1,200 days. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. We see the same period of time mentioned here again. But if we are dealing with God's people, the prophet people, then we understand that this is a literal duration. Well, that same period of time is found in Daniel. Daniel chapter 12 verse 7. Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time, and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Do you see similarity between those two texts? It is extremely so striking. Furthermore, we know of another 1,200 days prophecy, but a prophecy that has a prophetic value, that is where 1 day is equal 1 year. It corresponds to a period of persecution of God's people throughout the Middle Ages, persecution which lasted 1,260 years. This is not that surprising. Thus, there is a whole list of prophecies containing double application. Generally, a first application during the time of the prophet, and a second application for the end of time, as if the people of the end times, in just a few months or a few years, would sum up in its history all the history of God's people during whole centuries. Jesus spoke about it. He said, "What will happen will be the same as in Noah's time, and what happened in the days of Lot will happen likewise. Same with Sodom." We may also be reminded of the people in the desert. Let's read Matthew 24, where it is questioned about this people. The prophecy is dual. It speaks about the fall of Jerusalem, but also the end of the world. The disciples ask a double question. "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? When will these things be, that Jerusalem will be destroyed, and what will be the sign of your coming?" For them, of course, it was the same event, but they did not know that the fall of Jerusalem will take place 40 years later, and that the end of the world would come perhaps 2,000 years later. So you see, there are so many prophecies likewise. I could also quote the prophecy of Joel, the one we talked about. A rain of the Spirit, the former rain at the time of Pentecost, which is described in Act 2. And then a much broader reign of the Spirit, the latter reign, which will be bestowed on the people of God in the end time. So I'd like to read a text that is found in Luke chapter 17, verses 26 to 30. "And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." So you see, there is a striking parallel between the two events. I now propose we turn to our text in Revelation, chapter 11, verse 6. "These have power to shut heaven, so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. It is quite clear that reference is made here to what was done by Elijah and Moses. And so, those two witnesses look like Elijah and Moses. We must understand that Moses and Elijah represent two categories of people who will exist at that time. Two categories. Those who will pass through death, as Moses, just before entering the Promised Land, and those who will be taken up to heaven, as was Elijah. But whatever the population to whom we belong, at that time, both are saved. My dearest wish for you and for me is that we find ourselves in one or the other group of these people, no matter which, but among the elect.